These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. King Solomon sits on the throne of united Israel, having murdered his brother and most of his brother's supporters. One of the first things he's going to do is build the temple to the Lord, which he is eligible to do because he is not a man with blood-stained hands like his father was. Solomon's story is much simpler than his father's was, mostly a handful of episodes mixed into a record which reads quite a bit like a standard Mesopotamian chronicle, with the king boasting of his construction activities and personal virtues. Chronicles only gives him 2 chapters, aside from all the temple stuff, less than it gives to the less famous kings of Asa and Jehoshaphat. Not that the temple isn't important, of course, but for our purposes we can pretty much say Solomon built a big temple among his many construction projects, and he went around telling everyone that God was quite pleased with said temple. And to be fair, it sounds like a pretty nice temple, though if we take it literally, it is less grand and magnificent than the best efforts of the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, while still being pretty respectable. And to be fair, our year here is somewhere in the decades around 950 BCE, which is the depths of this Near Eastern Dark Age, so those great powers aren't actually currently building anything more impressive than this temple, even if they do have stuff from better days that's still standing. Now, the legends of Solomon are famous, and some of the extra-biblical ones are the best. In those, he could control the wind, talk to animals, and control demons, though in the latter case the demon broke free, stole the kingdom, and sent Solomon into exile until God intervened. It's a fun story. And there seems to be a whole genre of Solomonic wisdom tales. The Bible, of course, records the tale of the 2 mothers, with one baby between them, demanding that the king give custody of the child to each of them. Solomon orders the baby split in half and determines the true mother by seeing who is horrified and willing to give up anything for the child. In a tale which survives in the Quran, a vineyard owner was suing a shepherd for allowing sheep to eat the grapes. Solomon's judgment there was that the shepherd should own the vineyard until the vineyard repairs were completed, while the vineyard owner should own the sheep for the same period of time, allowing the criminal, the first one, to put in the effort and cost of repair, while the second enjoys the benefits of the livestock income. In another tale from the Quran, Solomon's army was traveling along the road, and a bunch of ants screamed out in terror because the ants were about to get stepped on. And of course, Solomon, being so wise, could talk to animals. He knew their language. He heard this, and he was so worried about squishing the little ant people that he ordered his army to be super careful as they walked to avoid stepping on any bugs. Now, you could see that with the Solomon wisdom tales, you get stuff that ranges all the way from anecdotes that, could have happened to someone somewhere, and maybe even Solomon himself, all the way to just straight-up parables. The famous ones are all pretty good moral lessons, like a wise king should understand the peasants to avoid crushing them. A similar thing's going on with Solomon's literature. Famously, Solomon is credited with writing the Book of Proverbs, as well as the Book of Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. With Proverbs, the authorship issue is much like David and the Psalms. Solomon is famous for his wisdom, and it seems unlikely that he would have developed that fame unless he was wise, unless there was something there that made people think at least he was wise. After all, David isn't famous for his wisdom. Most kings aren't famous for their wisdom. Solomon isn't famous for music, and neither are famous in the way that King Sholgi of the Sumerians was famous for running long distances and speaking the language of the traders from India. What's more, we can pretty confidently say that Solomon would have written down some proverbs. After all, we know from our studies of ancient literacy that an extremely common school assignment for those training to be scribes was to write or take dictation of long lists of proverbs, a way of both teaching writing and instilling a bit of moral education into the students. If Solomon had any pretensions to wisdom as a king and the son of a king, he was likely literate. And if he was literate, he would have been educated in something similar to the Edinburgh curriculum, which as far as we can tell was nearly universal in the Near East from 3000 BCE to about 300. Did he invent any of the proverbs, or did he just collect them? Now that we have absolutely no way of knowing. We know that there were tons of proverb collections, and indeed some say that chapters 22 through 24 are just straight plagiarized from an Egyptian proverb collection, but really all of these collections borrowed heavily from each other, with the wisdom of the authors being expressed particularly in the selection, ordering, and exact phrasing of the proverbs more than the novelty of what they came up with. After all, if they're expressing good moral lessons, most people just broadly agree on what are good moral lessons. You can't make up don't kill people. It's already come up with. Anyway, so it may well be the case that Solomon wrote either all or significant portions of Proverbs personally. Whether that's narrating it as a wholly new composition, or if he was just compiling them, either way, he would still be getting credit, even as a compiler, for making this nice piece of literature. It would not represent an implausible achievement. It seems like the sort of thing that most educated men were capable of if they were inclined towards it. But of course, it's also equally plausible that parts or all of it were written by someone else, and simply attributed to Solomon to trade off his reputation for wisdom. The important thing, of course, is that the reputation for wisdom must have come first before all of these imitators. As for Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon, there are pretty solid linguistic markers that indicate these were written by someone extremely familiar with Aramaic and Persian, perhaps even originally in an Aramaic dialect with a lot of Persian loanwords, and thus both are likely much later than Solomon himself, especially the Song of Solomon, which seems like fairly late love poetry. Now, the theme of Solomon's wisdom gets extended into the mentions of his foreign policy, which are scattered around. It's very hard to get a sense of timeline with Solomon, even more so than the previous eras, because his life really does have a sort of collected stories kind of feel to it. In any case, both the Kings and Chronicles narrators are really mostly concerned with the construction of the temple, beyond anything else he may have done. It is in the context of that temple construction that we hear about King Hiram of Tyre, who seems to have had a mercantile relation with David, and who makes a treaty to sell a bunch of raw materials, mostly, of course, lumber, since he's up near Lebanon, in exchange for agricultural products, because it's probably all that Israel really had in abundance. It's not a super rich area. Now, so this sounds like a perfectly normal interaction here. There's no mention that Hiram is a faithless pagan, because, of course, he's a friend, at least for this generation. The numbers are a bit challenging in the Hiram of Tyre story. It counts tens of thousands of men assigned to various corvée labor projects. These numbers can be rationalized a bit if one assumes this is like maybe the total number of men called out over an extended period of maybe multiple years, rather than imagining that the logistics existed at all to support some 150,000 men all at once. Or, of course, it could just be the normal problems with numbers, especially since we're going to see Solomon's wealth is massively inflated here soon enough. And I'll put that out right here. Was Solomon as wealthy as a literal reading would have it? No, he wasn't. I'm not going to justify that just yet. We'll get to it. Instead, we're going to note that the rest of Solomon's foreign policy is depicted as revolving around women. Now, the Queen of Sheba, believed to have been a royal on a trade mission from somewhere around modern Ethiopia, maybe up into Yemen. It's a very unclear, broad sort of area they probably didn't have a good sense of where it was back then either. I mean, I'm sure the Queen of Sheba knew where she was coming from, but everyone else, it's just an exotic lady, and she bears all the hallmarks of just being a tale of an exotic, wealthy beauty attracted to mighty Solomon. But, given what we know of ancient trade patterns, there's nothing strictly impossible here, especially as the lack of major powers elsewhere in the Near East may well have caused a distant emissary to check out the ascendant Israelite kingdom at its peak, when they might have normally visited the now struggling Mesopotamians or Egyptians. She doesn't have much significance by herself. The story really is just a way to show off Solomon. But it ties in with the legendary founding of Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jewish community of unclear antiquity. Why is my Mesopotamian history show in Ethiopian now? I'm not really sure, but I say this is all unclear because our earliest actual history for the Jews and Christians in Ethiopia is in a war in the 10th century CE, so like 2,000 years after this. But at this point, well, after Islam has pretty well cut off the Christian world from the global south, we see already formed communities which are both Jewish and Christian. I mean, there are Jewish communities and Christian communities. There's sort of a degree to which they both hybridize a little bit, especially the Christians take a lot of Jewish elements, but I don't mean that there's a Jewish-Christian super community. No, there's two different kinds of communities in Ethiopia. At least there were until all the Jews got kicked out. Now, the local languages have clear borrowings from Hebrew, specifically around religious topics. The book of Acts in the New Testament discusses an Ethiopian Jew, though whether this is the same Ethiopia as the Queen of Sheba is heavily debated. The prophet Isaiah seems to have thought that there were Jews down here somewhere, but the stories about their origin are many and varied, and not all of them are incompatible. Now, perhaps the most famous of these stories, though, is that the original king of Ethiopia was the son of this Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, the product of an affair during this trade mission. Supposedly, this son was the direct ancestor of Haile Selassie, the last Ethiopian monarch, and there's also claims that at least some of the Danites left after the death of Solomon, either due to the Egyptian incursion or the divide of the kingdom, as well as the possibility that one of the multiple Jewish diasporas saw a fragment of the community head down south. Now, in the middle of all this is the question of the Ethiopian claim to having the Ark of the Covenant. But as a white guy in modern culture, it does feel a bit off to discount the claims of an exotic, marginalized group without any clear evidence against their claims. And sure enough, just as there isn't very much in the way of support for their claims and a few competing narratives for both the foundation of the Ethiopian Jewish community and for the fate of the Ark of the Covenant, there's not actually any evidence against it either. And there are certainly things Western culture holds dear that are about as poorly supported in any case. There's already too many people on the internet beating up on the Ethiopian communities for thinking they have the Ark of the Covenant. I'm certainly not going to add to that. Now, aside from that Ethiopian connection, probably Solomon's most significant woman in his own time was the claim, which is made multiple times, to have married the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh. Now, this is a tough one, since on one hand we don't actually know which pharaoh this would have been. Not only are Solomon's dates pretty fuzzy, he's guessed probably to have straddled the 21st and 22nd dynasty transition, which is itself rather less well documented than other historical eras. People have criticized this claim as obviously false because Egypt simply did not give out royal women for marriage to outsiders, not even for marriage alliances. This was a point of political pride, but also it was a religious imperative. And there are some pretty sharp correspondences in the late Bronze Age involving the Egyptians refusing to send wives to foreign powers who don't really understand what the issue is for them. Now, the royal court was more than happy to have Egyptian sons marrying foreign women, but never vice versa. And so it's, they say, just a fantasy that Solomon could have scored such a wife. There are speculative counter-arguments, mostly focused around the fact that the final pharaohs of the 21st dynasty were pretty weak and may not have been in a position to follow the same openly hubristic policies of Ramesses or other Egyptian kings from the better times. Also, the 22nd dynasty opens with a pharaoh who is of Libyan descent, and does he maybe not hold quite so firmly to Egyptian traditions? I mean, do we have evidence for any of this? No, we don't. But it all exists in a gap in our knowledge. But of course, all of these women, they're not mentioned so much for themselves, but for the fact that they're basically ornaments of Solomon's wealth, influence, and power. Essentially fleshy baubles with the same fundamental purpose as the golden cups and the ornate constructions. All of which really brings us to the question of Solomon's wealth. Did Solomon own 1,000 women, 700 of whom were kept as wives? Now the answer, according to archaeology, is a pretty firm no. There's no doubt at all, that a powerful and wealthy man could potentially have had intimate relations with 1,000 women over the course of his life, especially if he had a nice long life, but he could not have afforded 700 wives. Now, wives are expensive, and I'm not just making a marriage joke here. My wife earns more money than I do, but in an ancient royal context, a wife was a seal of an alliance, either with a foreign power or with a local important family, which means she needs to be maintained at a certain royal standard. My wife doesn't have to be maintained at a royal standard, and thank God for that. Now, the exact power dynamics would vary from marriage to marriage, but there was pretty much always someone, and I mean some man, some male relative, who could at least potentially complain if a wife was being mistreated in a royal context. And let's not go too overboard with that. Women could be, and almost certainly were, at times abused. But the appearance of a lavish lifestyle was important all around here. And so, With that in mind, the claim of 700 wives, it's partly a claim of extreme virility, but it's also a claim of tremendous wealth. But it's far from clear that Solomon was actually that wealthy. Let's start, though, with the points in his favor. His father did spend a lifetime conquering people, which tends to build up the treasury, and there may have been residual inheritance even from the conquests of Saul. Now, those conquests also involve the taking and holding of land, possibly as vassal states and possibly as direct controlled territory, so tribute and taxes were likely flowing in at an unusually high rate. It's also said that he had punishingly high taxes, though some commentary traditions suggest that what happened was he spent his inheritance very quickly, then jacked up the taxes to maintain his expenditures after that, all of which just suggests a whole bunch of money coming in. Now, the famous mines of Solomon, said to be overflowing with gold, have been pretty frequently identified with the copper mines at Timnah down in the south of modern-day Israel, which he likely ruled over these mines in his time, if his territory is what the Bible says it is, and these would have generated a good bit of income for sure. Also, it seems he was extremely wise and well-educated, and if he truly held genuine wisdom, well, that's often a good way to maximize whatever you set your mind to. The story itself tells us that his wisdom is what led to his riches, and while his inheritance surely helped with that, we shouldn't discount the significance of a competent king in the ancient context. To look at the points against, however, we have basically the silence of all of archaeology. Like I've said a few times, we have no substantial archaeological evidence from this period. We can say that many of the cities mentioned were, in fact, occupied, and people lived there. But honestly, not very many people, and they weren't living in tremendous opulence. Population estimates are highly contested here, but there were either a mere handful of towns in the thousands of populations, or an extremely few in the low tens of thousands, with nearly every other place mentioned in the Bible being the home of a few dozens or hundreds of inhabitants. We don't see, archaeologically, any significant towns serving as power centers aside from those towns mentioned in the texts as major cities, which does suggest that there probably weren't any significant powers that we don't hear about. But overall, our picture is one of poverty, not opulence, among the region at large. We don't and possibly never will have an excavation of Solomon's palace, given the religious and political issues of the area, but what's crucial here is that we don't see him or anyone else projecting their wealth outside the palace itself. It's entirely possible that he was absolutely bleeding the people dry and spending his father's conquest plunder lavishly, and thus maintaining for himself a decent enough lifestyle. And I said he doesn't have 700 wives, but he probably has a good number of them. But every historic time of real, genuine prosperity in the ancient Near East is accompanied by various signs, both within the capital and out in the provinces. You see, truly wealthy kings build stuff. Now, what exactly they build, that varies a lot, from canals to temples to monuments to even manufacturing facilities and trade outposts. But the vast majority of the things that an ancient king could hope to accomplish with his reign, either for his own power or for the good of his nation, these involve construction of one sort or another. The main exception, of course, being conquest, but we're told that Solomon didn't do so much of that. The empire was already established by his time. But that empire, well, that's another issue. One of the proofs of empire in the ancient Near East is construction and inscriptions. But we see neither of these, so we have nothing to confirm the size of Solomon's kingdom. And the claimed size of this kingdom is bigger than you might realize. I have a map of it on the website, but it's said to have run from the edge of the Sinai Peninsula in the south up to the Euphrates River in Syria. And while it is a bit short on Mediterranean coastline, the inland area is substantial and would represent a significant trade crossroads in an era if there had been significant international trade, which there doesn't seem to have been in Solomon's generation. Now, this substantial claim is theologically significant, as some think it reflects the territory promised by God in the Abrahamic covenant. But when we bring the promises of God into the picture, now we can look at it so many different ways that it's overwhelming. It would take up a whole other episode about the Abrahamic covenant. We're not going to do that. It's a bit hard to see when some of this territory was actually brought in, though. We hear about David's conquests in general, but enough gets skipped that all this land could maybe have been brought under his control. Or, as we're going to see with Assyria, it could be that the Israelite core is under direct control, and the kingdom has so much military might that foreign nations offer tribute and submission voluntarily. Or, we'll call it voluntary, which is something suggested by the supposed vast amount of international leaders that come to visit the king. Though here they aren't so much interested in his wisdom as they are just sort of paying him to leave them alone. Some of these nations have probably been beaten in a war with Israel at some point, but some might just be aligning themselves here. Consider the modern American empire. We have some countries in our sphere of influence, like Japan and the Philippines, which we militarily invaded at some point in the past, and others like Poland and modern Israel, who side with us for geopolitical concerns without having been directly invaded. Of course, in the modern empire, it's the strong nations who give aid to the smaller, rather than the smaller giving tribute to the larger. But the point is that the idea of how much area a nation controls can be a fuzzy one, both in modern and in ancient times. And we can reasonably expect a royal chronicle to take the maximalist position on something like this. But although it can seem like a small point, I should reiterate that we have no evidence for Solomon's kingdom being extremely wealthy or unusually powerful. At best, it's regionally dominant. Of course, we haven't had evidence for a lot of the stuff we've been discussing in the last bunch of episodes. But for something like this, absence of evidence is actually pretty damning. Wealth leaves traces. Even if all his gold cups were melted down, even if all his inscriptions were actually on brass plates that were later looted, even if all his writings were originally in alphabetic script on papyrus and wood and leather, the populations are just too low. The city sizes are too small. The proposed constructions are too minor and too tenuous for the sort of wealth and power that we hear about in the text. When Assyria is rich, we can see it in the dirt. When Egypt is rich, we see it in the dirt. The Roman Empire left traces from Spain to Iraq. It's obvious when a place is rich. When a place is poor, history always ignores the poor, and even archaeology sometimes ignores the poor. If he was politically important, it's only because he was playing at the kids' table, while the legacy powers were all dormant. If he was personally quite wealthy, that's because he was the biggest fish in an extremely small pond, squeezing his peasants brutally. Now, that isn't to say he did nothing at all. He claims to have built a number of grain cities and military outposts. And perhaps he did. Although archaeologically, every claimed construction project from this period is heavily debated. These would have been, at best, small outposts, likely little more than a single building or a small compound built sometimes in existing tiny towns, or sometimes around these small buildings a tiny town would arise. A grain city could have been a location with a dozen families. A military outpost could have had 100 soldiers or less. Small towns are often found in archaeological surveys, but it's something else to find a specific small town, or rather to match a particular archaeological site to an ancient name. Large cities have a lot more records just to help us situate them, but even they're sometimes going decades between discovery and positive identification. I mean, we haven't found the ancient city of Akkad, which was the capital of a substantially larger empire that lasted longer, about twice as long as unified Israel, and was a major city for some time after. We can't find Akkad. Where is it? Nobody knows. And so it's going to be hard to find these little Solomonic outposts because they're nothing. They're tiny. And so while some have claimed to find the exact location of each of these Solomonic grain towns and military outposts, these claims are inherently dubious. And other claims that none of these sites have been found because the specific layers of construction in this period just haven't been identified in whatever their set of candidate towns are. It's a mess. It's a mess. More broadly, if we posit a relatively long, wealthy, and peaceful reign, then we would naturally assume that significant construction efforts took place. Of course, canals are mostly out of the picture because of the geography of the region, and he presumably can't build a whole bunch of temples for theological reasons, so we'll say he builds the one temple for sure. We can't excavate that, so we'll just grant it. And then he spends twice as long building his own palace, wherever that might be. That's fine. And the rest of his domestic policy would be focused around defensive and logistical structures. Indeed, he is kind of taken a page out of the playbook of the old Akkadian Empire, building logistical centers in newly conquered regions. I say newly conquered, but you may have thought, no, these are the core regions of Israel he's building these in. They're not newly conquered regions, but you're wrong. The territory of the other 11 tribes may have shared a religious system and a dialect and various aspects of common history and culture, or they may have shared none of these things, but they've only been politically unified for a generation at least, and they're clearly straining to pull apart, as we're going to see soon enough. Now, we usually think of Solomon's reign as peaceful. There is one last bit at the end of his life, though, in 1 Kings chapter 11, that makes mention of the fact that things weren't actually all peaceful. A number of enemies are mentioned, each given the title of Satans or adversaries against the good and righteous king. Oh, Satan, that's a big old topic. We're not going to get into that. But it's made clear that all of them are just evil. None of these Satans could have had justified reasons to oppose the good and righteous kingdom of Israel. For example, Hadad the Edomite an evil villain right there. He's got a pagan god right in his name, and a foreign country in his name, too. He was in his Edomite town during his youth when General Joab from King David's court showed up with the express intent of slaughtering every male in the entire country. The young boy escaped the slaughter of his people and he vowed revenge, ultimately taking refuge in Egypt. This is basically a revenge movie, but in summary. What isn't mentioned explicitly, because Royal Chronicles rarely mention defeats, is that he either had a military band raiding out of Egypt, or he took back at least part of Edom and he made it independent in a rebellion, or of course he could have done both. If we just hear that, oh, he escaped being murdered, and that makes him an enemy of Israel, that's a little bit evil. Oh my goodness. So no, he was some sort of military leader, and that was his origin story. Now another fellow has an equally dramatic story. He was an escaped slave from the Aramaean king of Zobah. Now while he's fleeing from his master, who was King Hadadezer, he gathered men around him and managed to take advantage of Hadadezer's defeat at David's hands. Now eventually he grabs Damascus from the pro-Israelite client rulers and builds his kingdom, and of course he naturally opposes the Israelites for reasons of political and military concerns. We don't have any reason to think he hated Israel in particular, but just being situated right there, taking a chunk out of Solomon's territory, probably trying to grow his own territory, that would have brought him into conflict with Israel. And of course, we assume, because these are so briefly summarized, that Solomon didn't repel any of these people successfully enough to boast of any victories. Now, the third person in the category, the general enemies category, who doesn't get called a Satan, but does get mentioned in essentially the same breath, is a famous fella, Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Well, we'll look at him soon enough. He's destined to be the king of the north. Indeed, actually, he's divinely destined for such if we follow the prophecy of Ahijah. Now, the last thing to look at before we move on is Solomon's faith. The traditional account tells us that his faith was strong and properly monotheistic in his early years, but the prodding of his many foreign wives induced him to first tolerate and later engage in polytheism, which is why he loses the favor of God. We get fewer details here than with Saul and David, but we're told that he eventually sponsors Ashtoreth of Sidon, Malcolm of Ammon, Chemosh of Moab, and Molech of Ammon. Like with Adam and Eve, it's portrayed as the woman's fault, but the man's responsibility. With the Baal veneration of Saul and David, it is at least plausible that this was, at heart, Yahwistic worship with syncretized elements in these previous generations. Or it could have just been unfortunate vocabulary. Baal meaning Lord. We call God Lord. Maybe Saul and David were calling God Baal, meaning Lord. Now with Solomon, though, we see a true plurality of divinities going on here, a return to the more ancient way of Near Eastern worship, in which diversity is seen as a strength, and an attitude of tolerance can bleed into true acceptance, none of which the biblical God approves of. But even though Saul was cast down for far less than this, Solomon is allowed to continue his reign for the rest of his life. But eventually, he dies. Now, we're told that 4 books were used as sources by the 2 historical accounts. The book of the Acts of Solomon, the prophecy of Ahijah, which may actually be the thing summarized at the end of Kings chapter 11, the history of Nathan, and the visions of Iddo. All of these books are probably lost, but it's nice to see an ancient writer citing sources. We actually haven't seen a whole lot of that in the rest of the Near East, and we won't see too much of it at all until the classical period. But it is a nice literary innovation, or if some have said, might be a literary marker of much later composition. Anyway, we're pretty much at the death of Solomon now, and following Solomon's death, the nation splits in two. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, is going to rule the south, and by the south I mean mostly just the tribe of Judah, while the other 10 tribes will be led by Jeroboam, that rebel leader, in the north. Rehoboam's succession is pretty straightforward. He's the designated heir, and no one really comes to challenge this claim. Jeroboam's story, however, actually started a little while ago. You see, Solomon was a tyrant. Some of his wealth came from his father's conquests, and some of it may have come from his careful management, but Kings makes it clear that he was hitting especially the corvée labor requirements extremely hard, and possibly also the tax burden was high as well. Now things get so bad that during the life of Solomon, a labor overseer from the house of Ephraim, Jeroboam, led, we could call it maybe a strike or a labor protest or perhaps just a full-fledged rebellion based on high taxes and hard working conditions. A popular revolt against a tyrannical king, but like most revolts, it's put down hard, and like most popular revolts, the leadership flees, this time to Egypt. But now that Solomon's dead, Jeroboam decides to return from his exile and rallies the working classes yet again. You have nothing to lose but your chains. And instead of just revolting, they actually go up to the new king and petition him for a decrease in taxes and a decrease in corvée labor. They seem to be very polite about it. Now, there are many potential ways the new king could have handled this. And Rehoboam chooses the most comically overblown way possible, informing the petitioners that, "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." Scorpions here are whips with spiked tips. But Rehoboam's platform of, "I'm gonna raise your taxes and also whip you harder," turned out to be surprisingly poorly received and actually not a crowd pleaser. Jeroboam takes all those folks who he'd been petitioning with, and they all go north out of Judahite territory, and they declare their independence from Judah. Except that the territory they hold is a vastly disproportionate chunk of the good land, so it's more like they just decide to have their own kingdom, just without Judah. Now Rehoboam was still sort of hoping to mend the breach, get those guys back under his whips, and so he sends a fellow named Adoniram to go negotiate. And the negotiations, to be fair, they go better than expected. The people throw stones at Adoniram until he dies, sure, but the king, when he flees in his chariot, does end up surviving, which is far better than how that really could have ended. And as the narrator helpfully points out, the breach persists into the time of writing, whenever that was. Rehoboam actually wanted to make one more try at healing the breach, the kind of healing that involved gathering up soldiers and slaughtering the other 10 tribes, but some prophet named Shemaiah, whose name suggests that God himself heard what Rehoboam was planning and is intervening here, calms everyone down, and they all go home in peace. And I think that's where we're going to leave it today. The kingdom is divided, and the north and south will never again be united until 1948. And even then, it's mostly just going to be the southern tradition dominating. we aren't actually yet into what most people would call history, but we can see history from where we're standing out in the distance there. Now, we're going to get the incursion of the outside world to deal with next episode in Shishak's invasion. But aside from that, following kings were only 4 relatively quick chapters away from Omri and Ahab, the first people in the Hebrew Bible who all can agree, based on non-biblical contemporary sources, actually existed. Oh, I'm excited for that. But that's not going to be next time. Hopefully the episode after that. We'll see. But that isn't to say that next episode's just going to be filler. Join us next time for a fun bit of war, Ark of the Covenant speculation, and a lot of discussion about the religious development of Israel and Judah. Thank you for listening.